Doing that, inviting really every conservative group that does federal policy work into the project, and all but a couple joined, made it a bigger target. We should have anticipated that the left would have been just lost their ever-loving minds as a result. But ultimately, their efforts failed. They wasted a bunch of money. And what they did succeed in doing is double the number of people who are in the personnel database from 10,000 to 20,000. I'm grateful that a good portion of the $1 billion that Kamala Harris raised actually helped us expand the reach of the project, because it's actually going to allow us to expand the number of states and places where these great people are going to be involved. So they inspired a lot of Americans to rise up, and I can't thank them enough.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review, because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Dr. Kevin Roberts, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks, Bradley. Great to be here.
Yes, well, you have this new book, Dawn's Early Light. We're going to talk a lot about the book today, but first, I think it's worth opening our conversation with a question that I asked you at your book launch event on Thursday in Washington, which is, you named this book Dawn's Early Light. The title was chosen before we knew the results of the election. Throughout the election, it looked really close between Kamala Harris and President-elect now Donald Trump. I didn't know how things were going to go. Turns out Republicans get a trifecta. Conservative causes win across the country. And for the first time in 20 years, since I've been politically active, a Republican presidential candidate won the popular vote. What gave you the confidence to name the book Dawn's Early Light when I wouldn't have named my book that?
Well, as you know, I've been confident about the satisfactory outcome of the election for weeks, if not months. But we settled on the title for this book many months before that, before it was clear that, in fact, at least clear to me, that Trump was going to win. And so pretty obvious, it's great if you have conservatives who've won, because we've got an opportunity not just to win an election and get great policy, but Bradley, as you know, to do what we do at Heritage, to actually build the movement, to really expand this. But to the heart of your question about what would have happened if the vice president had won, it would have been bad. And it would have been really bad for us at Heritage. It would have been bad for several people who are active conservatives, bad personally, not because they did anything wrong. But I still thought, even if she wins, we're sticking with the title, because it's still America. And even if we're going down, we're going to go down fighting. In the same way that Francis Scott Key, when he's peering through that fog in 1814 and pins this phrase, actually didn't expect to see the American flag. He expected to see the Union Jack, because that's really what rational thought would have taught him. But as it turns out, God's given us another chance. And the other sort of nuance in Dawn's Early Light is, we're not saying, oh, this is it. It's done. Like, we've totally won. You can go back and take a nap and stop working. The hard work really begins, just as it began after winning the War of 1812.
Yeah, the hard work begins again. And you're working with a coalition that I don't think 8-10 years ago anyone would have ever thought possible.
I wouldn't have. You know, I might have predicted that Trump would win, but I wouldn't have predicted this coalition.
Yeah, this coalition. And there's two sides of the coalition, right? There is the politically active. We have completely turned over the donor class. That's really interesting.
It's huge.
But the thing about living in a republic, and the thing about populism is, as our friend Nigel Farage said on his way out of the EU Parliament, the thing about populism is it's very popular. It's good to have populism and popularity when we're talking about winning elections in a representative government. I don't think anyone predicted a coalition like this, though. I mean, he's underwater with Latinos, period, by only 6 points. He outright wins Latino men. African-American voters come out for Donald Trump in numbers that we've not seen, I think, in my lifetime at least. Suburban women, that was always, the suburban women, they're going to carry Kamala Harris to victory. No, they actually stayed relatively conservative and went with Donald Trump. Working class men, in particular, middle class and lower middle class men gravitated towards President Trump. So you have this coalition, this genuine multiracial working class coalition, coming behind the conservative common sense message of President Donald Trump. What do you think that means moving forward for the right?
I think in a policy sense, the sky's the limit. And so whether it's very long-standing traditional conservative objectives of creating more limited government. In this case, our focus is on dismantling the administrative state, getting Congress, of course, to be more active there, or whether it's something that really is new for the conservative movement in its political sense. It's not as new for the conservative movement in its more important social and cultural sense, which is embracing the role that government can play in cultivating a healthier lifestyle. And by that, I still, if I have my druthers, want government to be very limited. I want it to largely get out of the way by making sure that there isn't this terrible collusion between big corporations and big government, in this case, big pharma. That's actually exceedingly consistent with conservative principles. But what it also makes me reflect on, Bradley, is that the power of leaders, every generation or two or three, in bringing to life what Americans are intuiting, but don't yet have the vocabulary to bring to life in a political sense, is impossible to miss right now. You know, I remember as a very young undergraduate history student, we would have this intellectual exercise with our history professors, and it's pretty elementary, but it's fun, and I think it's apropos here. Does the man make history, or does history make the man? Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, it's both. But in this election, you had to have Donald Trump bring all of this to life in the same way that he did in 2016. And while I still wish that he had been certified the winner in 2020, notice the words that I chose there, I think it's providence that he did not, now that he's won the 2024 election, because we wouldn't have all of this coming together in terms of a coalition. And this coalition, which I think is going to be ascendant and dominant in American politics for a generation or two, isn't just going to wield political power using policies that we like better. Much more importantly, I actually think it's going to revitalize self-governance. I really believe that's what's at stake here. And goodness gracious, we're a couple steps along the way. It's glorious.
I've been reflecting a lot on what Tucker said at the Republican National Convention, which is the leader of the nation is not someone who holds a fancy title or an office. The leader of the nation is the bravest man. And after being on the ground in Butler, Pennsylvania, when that all happened, and then going right to Milwaukee and hearing Tucker said that, it was like, yep, that checks out for me. And when I look at, if he had won in 2020, it would have been by skin of the teeth. You don't feel like the mandate. It's almost like with Trump out of power for the last 4 years, it created the oxygen for this great awakening to happen. And I think without Trump winning this election cycle, a lot of things would still be in flux. And now we're settling into, I think, what is a beautiful new phase. I think the Trump campaign has picked this up, right? They want to call it the golden age. There is a real opportunity for the golden age because you have a coalition like never before, uniting behind not only the need to fix America's current problems, but the need to project a substantive vision for America for the next 20, 30 years that enable people to live normal lifestyles. And I was having a conversation with a friend who I'll identify them as someone in the center. And he's like, Bradley, this is all really great. I'm glad that you've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this, but you're thinking too hard about this. You're being too nerdy about it.
I've said that to you before.
Yeah. Wasn't you. You are not my friend in the center.
That's right. Thanks for that clarification. But I have said that to you before.
Have said, yeah, you're dorking out about this too much. But the reality is that the material conditions were bad. And Democrats should not be freaking out about this. You got hit with COVID. And in 2020, that led to a change of the guard with President Joe Biden in 2021. And President Joe Biden was dealing with those ramifications, and it was just the material conditions. Wages weren't going up; they were still stagnant. They were under 2019 wages in real terms. You had inflation. You had a porous border, which was an active policy decision. But even if there were some Remain in Mexico policies left, like immigrants come when there's a Democrat in charge. It's just the way it is. Like, you're focusing way too much on this meta-narrative. It's actually just the fundamentals. My read of that is the fundamentals surely are important. It just feels too materialistic, right? It just feels too simple for the I don't know, just the gravity of the moment, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, first of all. So bottom line up front, I do think that both of those claims can be true up to a point. That is up to a point with what your friend in the center said. And that is the fundamentals were vital, particularly in, say, swing districts, swing U.S. House districts. Those fundamentals change things. So it's not that he's entirely wrong. But I think he's missing the moment probably because he exists in the political center and doesn't understand, and I don't mean that too pejoratively, maybe a little bit, the meta-narrative that we have been suffering under for a generation. And it's a meta-narrative governed predominantly by Barack Obama, not just because he was president, but because he is the personification of what the radical left is in modern America. But some of the supporting characters, some of the supporting cast in that center-left, increasingly radical left narrative are Republicans who tell us that it would be better to wear the Ukrainian flag, lapel pin, than it would be to protect the southern border. That it's better to have unfettered globalization, even at the expense of some communities in the United States, than it would be to entertain some novel, innovative ideas as conservatives to arrest that decline. And so the meta-narrative that Trump is personifying now and that many of us are participating in is a meta-narrative that is entirely consistent with the founding of the country. And I'd emphasize this in the book. And that is, yes, self-governance, people understand what that means, but more specifically, because we ought to push on that, it means that we want to wake up in a normal country, and that means that we're fine with political disagreements, but what we're not fine with is that we don't have the freedom of speech to talk about it. Mm-hmm. What we're not fine with is that it is literally true that too many people on the political right are persecuted by the Department of Justice and the FBI, and go on and on and on. But thank goodness for leaders of nations and brave men. And Donald Trump, and this might sound like hyperbole, but I think about Donald Trump being modern America's version of other brave men who've been leaders of their nations. Abraham Lincoln, who was known as the bravest man of his generation because in the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, he was so brave as to stake out a popular position in the North, but very unpopular. It ultimately literally cost him his life for stopping the expansion of slavery. Charlemagne, founder of early modern Western civilization. I'm an Anglophile. I think often about Alfred the Great, the founder of the modern English state. Mm-hmm. He was a very sickly man, diminutive, sickly. I say that not to pick on him, but to say you wouldn't expect him to be this lion-hearted fellow on the battlefield, but he was. You know why? Because he loved his nation. Donald Trump is in that vein. What's interesting is, to tie all of this up, is that when you have those brave men emerge as leaders of nations, the reason the nation says, yes, we want you to be our leader, is because they tap into that meta-narrative. It can't just be about the fundamentals.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't only my friend on the center, but I think there are some individuals in the consulting class that run around this town, maybe some individuals who work on K Street as well, who would agree with his characterization. I can't help but feel a little bit of happiness when I think about all the consultants who have for years been pushing the conservative movement and the Republican Party to embrace identity politics or suffer permanent electoral defeat and permanent exile to the wilderness.
They deserve every bit of it.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to see them be proven wrong, because I see a multiracial working class coalition emerge without having to play that game.
These people dislike ordinary Americans. They dislike them. And when you press them on that, of course they deny that. And I sort of developed a little bit of a habit in DC, privately and sometimes publicly, of pressing them on that. They deny it, of course, but then their response almost automatically is condescension. Condescension to us at Heritage for asking the question. Condescension to us at Heritage for, as an example, being funded as one of these people says, red state grandmas. I want to spike the football on their face. not because of me or heritage, but because America is ascendant again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fascinating to see the way in which the donor class has flipped, right? You see
it's remarkable.
The consulting class and the donor class work together, obviously. The consulting class is downstream, I think, of the donor class in many, many ways, because if they don't spend much time talking to people in real America, they get their orders somewhere else, and they put together the little reports and their little plans, and they work on campaigns, and they say, listen, you need to pick a woman, or you need to pick a minority to fill this position, or you're just not going to be liked by the average person. I think not only has the donor class shifted, but hopefully the entire consulting class will be flipped based on that switch. I mean, you know a lot of these folks who have come along with the movement that Trump has made on the right, the David Sachs types, the Silicon Valley dissidents, Elon Musk. What do you think pulled them in at the beginning, and where do you think the relationship with them goes as this new coalition matures?
As I've talked to a lot of them, it seems as if for many, if not most of them, the first time their eyes were opened to the game was during the COVID lockdowns. And for some subset of those folks, that then became their hobby horse, in the best sense of that phrase. And then that led them to an understanding of why it is that ordinary Americans have distrusted government institutions for so long, dating way back to Reagan and really sort of originating with Watergate scandal on the left and the right. But then for others of them, it was the treatment of Trump. And I applaud both of those camps, but particularly the latter one, because there are in the Silicon Valley friends, and in categories of other former leftists. I think about our heritage friend, Jennifer Say. We talked about this explicitly, so I'm comfortable mentioning her name. And we talked about it publicly. She said, look, I'm still a political liberal, in the sense that I prefer policy outcomes that are somewhat different than what heritage prefers. But what unites us, and what Trump helped me understand, was how much people are in D.C. and New York are trying to concentrate power for themselves at the expense of everyone else. And she says that transcends politics. It transcends political labels. So, and then finally, for a lot of them, the exclamation point was Butler, PA. That, oh my gosh, these people, whatever the actual truth of Mr. Crooks was and is, these people tried to kill the personification of this movement that's trying to fix this distrust in our institutions. Something must be wrong here, and let me be part of it rather than sitting on the sidelines. It's a fascinating moment. It's encouraging, but the real work will be keeping that coalition together, right? Mm-hmm. Because governing is always hard. The left is better at governing because they are at their nature a lot more collectivist. And therefore, governing, as Edmund Burke would say, if he were sitting here with us, is always hard for conservatives because we're not. It's going to take over-communicating internally and externally to really harness the power of this coalition.
And you lay out in one of the chapters of your new book what that thrust can be towards for this new coalition. You call it Family First Fusionism. What is Family First Fusionism? What are the types of policies that emerge from that?
It's on one level a rhetorical shift, but by that I actually mean that to be even more substantive than rhetorical, and that is to say sort of a different mindset. That is, rather than talk about macro level economic indicators that supposedly show the health of America, such as the gross domestic product increasing from one year to the next, we're actually looking at other measures that I think are a lot better, such as declining inflation, grocery prices, the average wages for our median household income, to some extent even marriage rates and birth rates. What we're trying to do at Heritage is actually give not just voice but real power to those indicators, such that at some point, if I had my druthers, next year if it takes 5 or 10 years to do this, we wouldn't talk about the gross domestic product as the end-all be-all. It's a nice measure to have. But we would talk about something that's like the Human Flourishing Index or Self-Governance Index, where we have some formula that shows that American families and communities are a lot more stable than they are now. If we're able to do that, whatever the measure is, I'm not smart enough to figure that out, but I do work with people who are smart enough to figure that out, and I've given them that charge. I think that's a pretty cool Manhattan Project for the conservative movement that actually will include a lot of people, at least on the center left, and maybe some dyed-in-the-wool leftists will at least appreciate the intention of what we're trying to do here. And I think that that can be very galvanizing as well. If we're able to invert our current system, which even sometimes explicitly, but always at least implicitly, puts the interests of elites in Washington and New York and Brussels ahead of the interests of ordinary Americans, invert that not just into an emphasis on individualism. I'm not too interested in that, but an emphasis on families, on communities, on revitalizing institutions. Washington is going to get out of the way, even if some of the policy outcomes are not perfect.
Mm-hmm. The Family First Fusionism chapter starts with a characterization of the old fusionism, the fusionism that animated the Reagan movement, that persisted through the Cold War. It's just been known as fusionism. You don't have harsh words for it. You just say it was politically apropos, but ultimately it's not what the movement needs right now.
It's just
Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, it's outdated. And I do try to ascribe to everyone the best of intentions. Not everyone deserves that. Just generally, I don't mean it in that particular effort. Heritage was a vital part of it. And I was a part of it. It's just outdated. And we should stop talking about it. We should stop talking about Reagan as much. And I love Reagan. You know that. I mean, my Zoomer friends like you or millennial friends say, Kevin, why in the world do you keep talking about Reagan? Guys, he's a hero. But
whenever anyone adds ism to the end of Reagan's name, that's when the red flag goes up for me.
Yeah, and that's a really good point.
If we want to have a conversation about Reagan and how great he was, that's great. I don't want to hear about how great Reaganism is, because I don't think anyone who is promoting Reaganism in the year of our Lord 2024 knows a thing about what he tried to do to the Japanese auto industry, for example. That's just part of the history, the complication, right? People are complicated. Men are complicated. To be a good leader, to be a good, not only conservative, but a good statesman, is to grapple with reality. And when you try to turn someone's statesmanship into an ideology, like we don't talk about Washingtonism, Lincolnism. Like you would think that someone's crazy if they brought that up. And nevertheless, Reaganism persists. So if anyone tries to take a record of a statesman and turns it into an ideology, I think they fundamentally misunderstand what a statesman is.
That's particularly astute.
Yeah.
Which means I'm guilty of this, because occasionally I'll answer the question, I don't think I'm guilty of the Reaganism thing. I agree with you entirely. A lot of people using Reaganism as a term are people who are trying to use the popularity of the statesman, to your point, to explain why their own outdated, perhaps even wholly wrong policy ideas are somehow consistent with conservatism, and they're not. The thing that I'm guilty of occasionally is talking about Trumpism, and you can tell me if I'm as wrong, but the motivation there is to try to explain what this ideology, what this set of beliefs looks like after Trump leaves office.
Because there's an underemphasis. Yeah. Like you actually, in Trump's case, there's too much focus on the man and not enough focus on the core
that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But in 40 years, if we're talking and I'm saying Trumpism, then you can correct me.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. And that's the danger for me too, because I think a lot of people who yell Reaganism today were my age when Reagan was president, and love the man for totally legitimate and understandable reasons. If you had to add an attributive noun, though, right? Like, so the Family First Fusionism, if you had to add a descriptor in front of the old fusionism, what would that be? Is it like anti-communist fusionism? Is it liberal fusionism, libertarian fusionism?
It's hard to one word or one phrase, but an anti-communist free market fusionism. And social conservatives were part of that, but they were always the stepchild. But vital for electoral victories. The real thrust of that was defeating the Soviet Union, which was appropriate, and attendant with that, increasing the number of societies that were truly free market or close to it. Those were the primary forces behind that.
And I think that it's disgraceful to see social conservatives treated as the stepchild whenever they are, because they ultimately are the people who understand the base and the grassroots. And if you want to have a representative government, you need to understand where the social conservatives are at. That much I totally agree on. But there's an element of, okay, you understand why in the coalition it was de-emphasized because the institutions were strong. The American family was strong. I don't know if I've told you this before. There's a saying with young journalists who work particularly on family policy or cultural issues, and it's, you either are someone who came from an abnormally large religious family. Our friend Mary Margaret Olahan comes to mind, where like I have difficulty keeping all of her siblings straight, or you come from not the ideal family situation. You care about families because your upbringing was not.
I don't think you would call it ideal.
Not ideal. And you open up about that in the book. And we've been friends for a few years now. And I didn't know that much about your background and your story. And I don't know, just tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your story, because I think it's so interesting that now you're the president of the Heritage Foundation and we're grappling with all the same issues that you experienced as a boy. But your experience was basically a leading indicator for what happened to large portions of this country.
Yeah, two things convinced me to write about that. I like most of us, I guess, fairly private, and a lot of people have had difficulties in their lives. So I don't think that I'm very special. But two things convinced me of that. One of them was very much related to this opening point of your question here, and that was institutions being strong, and therefore the social conservatives who composed one leg of the three-legged fusion stool were almost always relegated to being the stepchild. Well, until the last generation, when some of us, myself included, started telling DC conservatives, guys, now's all the more reason for social conservatives not just to have a seat at the table and receive the courteous pat on the head, but for us to really be thinking about policy that reflects them.
Absolutely.
And explicitly, since I've been in DC, I have seen, I have heard, I've been told to my face, we have at Heritage, the country's great, the world's great. Freedom and equality are increasing. What are you talking about? And I said, okay, I'm going to have to find a different way to explain this because I'm not being very persuasive. And then the second was the election of J.D. Vance to the Senate. And that's when the friendship that he and I enjoy began. And I had read Hillbilly Elegy. I was very moved by it. I read that book in about a day and a half. And while some of our situations growing up were a little bit different, they were more similar than anything. In my case, my dad had an addiction problem. He's a recovering alcoholic to this day. I'm very proud of him and love him. But when I was 8, 9, and 10, it was awful. It was awful for anyone around him. And he and my parents got divorced at a very early age, as many Americans have experienced. And it got very ugly. And it ultimately was a contributing factor to my brother, when he was 15, committing suicide. I was 9. And as I was thinking about this book and wanting to do what we do at Heritage, which is to bring human faces to our policy, the people who were helping me with the book, some mutual friends and our publisher, kept pushing me, my own chief of staff, to write about my childhood chapter. And so I was convinced to do that in service to the broader effort of convincing these people in DC, whether they're on K Street or maybe they're well-intentioned conservatives who just have not updated their thinking, that most Americans have had some difficulties, whether on this scale or another, and we are part of the movement and we have something to say about that. Not because, again, we're unique, but this is the sort of the quintessential American experience right now, and public policy doesn't reflect it, and the conservative movement doesn't reflect it. And I'm gratified that J.D. Vance's story has galvanized people to pay attention to the plight of Appalachia, the deleterious effects of globalization. And I hadn't put all that together in my own experience, because this difficult childhood, to wrap up here, was also happening at the same time of, in essence, a Great Depression in my oil and gas town and oil and gas region. And everything, almost everything that would matter to a human fell apart. Mm-hmm. But what didn't fall apart are the enduring things. For me, my grandparents, who taught me my faith. And and community institutions that were somehow able to persist through this. Government was not the answer, although for some people, at least temporarily, it was. My mom and I lived in subsidized housing, so I'm grateful for that. But it's also, I think, as I reflect on the kind of conservative that I am, it's a conservative philosophy that understands at the heart of all of this is the dignity of the human person, first and foremost starting with Americans' interest first.
On Thursday when we chatted, we talked a little bit about the section of your book about populism. You say, I don't have the full quote in front of me, I read it for the audience, but you say, so let them label us populist. That's okay, actually. I thought that was great. And I was very happy to read that in the president of the Heritage Foundation is saying, so let them label us populist. I know what timeline are we on? But it's so true. Let them label us populist, because when so much of the 90s and the early 20th century, or early 21st century, America was strong. And yet, at the grassroots level, a populist movement was taking shape around the exact issues that you faced growing up. Obviously, marriage rates have only declined since you were a child. Birth rates, same way. Divorce rates have increased. Children out of wedlock increased. Bowling alone, etc. Now it feels like that was a leading indicator that America wasn't as strong as it purported to be. Do you think that because I'm of two minds on this. Bad things were happening on the grassroots level doesn't mean that there wasn't real American strength and prosperity. Though the gains were centralized, it could have been diffused properly, and that was our mistake, is we didn't diffuse it properly. Or is it kind of a lagging indicator from substantive policy changes that happened before the decline of the family, right? So when you talk about no-fault divorce, it's one of my bugaboos with the man Reagan when he was governor of California. No-fault divorce, also, the end of institutionalization as we know it, despite the abuses that happened in that system. Like, were they better off in the asylum, or were they better off on the street, right? So I don't know if it's a lagging indicator or a leading indicator, these societal problems.
It's hard to tell, but it strikes me that it's more of a leading indicator. To be a little more definitive, I would very happily, comfortably, confidently make the claim that it's a leading indicator. Mm-hmm. And that policy decisions, whether it's no-fault divorce or some of the tax code that disincentivizes marriages and incentivizes out-of-wedlock births, while downstream from that leading indicator accelerated the decline. And so policy certainly has had an effect. And I guess that's what struck me as I was writing the book, Bradley, is I experienced being part of that leading indicator. Tens of millions of Americans did. Mm-hmm. And then particularly when I made the transition from being an academic to being in public policy, I realized the only people talking about this are people who are on the right, are people who are pretty much just academics. They don't purport to have a direct impact on policy. God bless them. And
Though they should.
Although they should, because they're really smart. Let's see if we can do something about this. And, at the very least, what we ought to be doing is having a conversation about it. Just facilitating the conversation about all of this has taken us as a movement 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I find that rather ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. All of the animating ideas that you put forth in this book are effectuated in some way in a policy book called Project 2025.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. Have you?
Very proud of that book, by the way.
900 pages of policy. It was very funny to see a giant copy of it brought on stage at the Democratic National Convention. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I really hope Dr. Roberts at someday is able to buy that copy, the giant copy.
I am
at the DNC.
Working on it.
Yeah. At auction or something.
We're going to sell it at an auction for like $1 billion.
Yeah, actually, that's what we need to do. Hey, Kamala Harris campaign, if you're looking to get out of debt, The Heritage Foundation will buy the giant copy from you. This is an offer. This is an offer if you're listening, Kamala Harris. If you want to get out of debt, let Dr. Roberts know. But
this is a great idea, by the way.
I think it's hilarious. I think it's a great troll. It's like Onion trying to buy InfoWars, but you guys would do it legally. The Project 2025, when I look at it, one of the major, actually I got a call from my stepmom who is center right, I'd say. She gives me a call and she's like, I know that you're friends with a lot of people who worked on this product, but getting rid of the Department of Education, and her mom is a school teacher, and there's never been in America in her lifetime where like the Department of Education wasn't in some way, shape, or form influencing her life directly.
Sure. Yeah.
And I was like, that's really interesting. That's really interesting that you bring that in particular.
Yeah.
Because that is probably one of your biggest things, which is we need to get rid of the Department of Education. And I kind of take a step back from this and say, okay, if you got rid of the Department of Education on day one, you still have Department of Educations all over the country in their various states. Like, is there an order of operations problem? Is there this isn't exactly the perfect encapsulation, but is there Hamiltonian means to Jeffersonian ends when you're looking at something like the Department of Education? Because if you scrap it, right? I'm from California. If the right isn't in control of the National Department of Education and there is no more national conversation about education, then like I'm just leaving the Department of Education in California under the great leadership of Gavin Newsom to do whatever the heck that it wants to my brother and sister who are still in the school system in California, right? I mean, they're people in public schools in California, children in public schools in California are learning about the validity of Aztec and Mayan religious rituals where children were sacrificed. I mean, it's the most absurd things that you could possibly learn in the classroom. And that's coming from not necessarily the national Department of Education. It's much more coming from the Department of Education in California. So is there an order of operations problem to dismantling something like the Department of Education?
There's certainly an order of operations, but let me be, as a good friend, combative. That's not a problem. Did you see California schools get markedly better under George W. Bush's 2 terms? Did they get better under Donald Trump's first term? No. And secondly, in fact, the Aztec and Maya problem that you mentioned is funded by the U.S. Department of Education. Almost everything that's wrong with American education is because of the U.S. Department of Education. It funds directly and indirectly the worst institutions in this country, which are colleges of education. There are but 5 or 6 or 7 that are worthwhile. The rest actually ought to just be deleted. Education majors in this country are the worst students academically in this country. Nothing against them as human persons, nor am I making the claim that any credentialed teacher out there who's conservative is a bad person. I'm just telling you what the data say. And if, in fact, we're going to be in this generation when entrepreneurs like Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are driving government efficiency, I'm telling you that the U.S. Department of Education, since its creation of 1979, has been an abject failure. The only thing that has happened since then is that educational attainment in every demographic group and in every state has gone down. Are there other factors there? To your point about the order of operations, and obviously giving the most benefit of the doubt to your wonderful stepmother, of course. Yeah. And so the real validity of the question that you're asking and the claim that your stepmother's making is you got to do this in the right order and protect whatever valid role the education department's playing. And I would argue that there are some in Title I civil rights provisions. I would like to think that eventually this society will grow out.
But you can move that to DOJ.
That's where I'm driving, Bradley, is that those functions can be served in other departments. There are people on the political right who want a federal school choice program. Heritage is tepidly supportive, and we're tepid not because we don't support school choice. We're the largest proponent of school choice around this country and do more work on that than anyone else. It's that we don't want the federal government to be in it because that's the lesson. And so we would say, if in fact that's what you want to do, just house that in the Department of Treasury.
So the answer to bringing these rogue state departments or institutions to heal is just to turn off the spigot.
It's to turn off the spigot and trust the people. And so just bear with me on this corollary.
No, go for it.
One of the things that comes up, and this I am going to step into the weeds here, so for in the audience, I'll make this succinct. One of the battles that we have in state legislatures on school choice programs in the implementation of it is how much quote unquote accountability do you want to put on those dollars? Standardized tests, one state, Louisiana, early version of school choice. I participated in this in the school that I started, would require the students at a private school to take the state test. There are even more onerous accountability measures. The greatest accountability measure, according to my colleague at Heritage, Jay Green, in 71 out of 72 studies he surveyed, are parents. So my point is, if we actually believe what we say, if politicians believe what they say on the stump, which is that parents are the first and primary educators of their children, and we ought to trust parents before anyone else, parents are going to improve California schools. Because parents are going to say, we've had enough of this stuff. I'm just convinced that if you turn off the federal spigot and you sort of turn off the ability of the Democrat, the radical left administrations when they control the department to really damage education, parents are going to step up.
Let's continue to blend those two books.
You're having fun with this.
Oh, I do. I have a ton of fun with this because I learned a lot about forestry in your book.
You weren't expecting that.
I wasn't expecting it, no. And but as a man in the American West, I can kind of expect it a little bit.
Yeah, actually, Californians of all people would get this.
Yeah, exactly. I learned a lot of things that I should be petitioning my home state government on from reading this book. But you use it as an analogy, forest management to as an analogy to getting rid of the dead state, or the deep state, clear the deadwood, dead state, deep state. You could become that. Clear out the deadwood. Get rid of the bureaucracy. Radically shrink government. Not because we don't want the American people to succeed, but because actually Washington's in the way. Taking Back Washington to Save America, subtitle. Washington is in the way, and when you free up people to take accountability of their own lives, like they actually will answer the call. Like this just seems anthropologically true from a review of history. In the Project 2025 book, there's a number of policies that you guys put forth to get rid of the deadwood, and it's not just getting rid of the Department of Education. As fun as you might have with that if it comes about in the next 4 years. What are some of the other policies that we should put into place to clear out that deadwood?
Well, I think the biggest within the government, and I'll talk about institutions that are non-governmental, if I may. Within the government, I think the helpful way to think about this metaphor of a controlled burn is not even that we're going to succeed in eliminating entire departments. I do hope we will with the Department of Education, but that if you get to the second or third level down and you're looking at sub-agencies or agencies within a particular department, that those need to be dramatically overhauled. Perhaps the most famous or infamous, but it's the best example in this case, would be the FBI. I think that there is a constitutional and appropriate and philosophical reason to have a federal law enforcement agency. I think that the one that we have now is unconstitutional and unjust and evil. And so I think we need to start from scratch. But most likely is that Congress will give the president some authority to do a pretty moderate reform, and that needs to happen. That is actually it's a great example of a controlled burn, because if you go into Sam Houston National Forest in East Texas, which actually, believe it or not, even with swamps, sometimes has such a drought that they've got to do some controlled burns. You don't want to burn the whole forest. You're trying to burn particular parts of it where the deadwood has accrued and really is a fire danger, even in a place that's so humid just north of Houston. But other examples would be, this is a pet project of mine, a pet interest, because I've had friends in Wyoming who've been victimized by this. Why is it that the Environmental Protection Agency has a law enforcement division? Burn it, figuratively. Go in, and if the 175 or 500 or however many agents there are really good law enforcement professionals and they have a great service record, give them the opportunity to fill vacant positions or give them an early retirement. And if they're great law enforcement people, let's have them go serve their local sheriff's department. The point is not them as human persons.
Right. Why aren't they working for the Interior Department?
Yeah, exactly. And why should an armed EPA person show up on a Wyoming ranch, and this happened to a friend of mine, and multiple friends of mine in Wyoming, and even have the right to step foot on private property. These are examples of the kinds of things that will happen. But I have to conclude this part about government with this point. It's going to take 10 or 15 or 20 years to do this. So we need a lot of political will over that time. But where I focus a lot of my attention, Bradley, as you know from having read the book, is on the controlled burns, figuratively speaking, of course, about private institutions. I pick on the New York Times because I think they're awful. I pick on the Boy Scouts of America. As a proud Eagle Scout, they were vital to my childhood and young adulthood, but they've gone woke and they're terrible and they shouldn't exist. I pick on Ivy League colleges. Most state universities are utter wastes of money. I've just posited that 98% of colleges of education should have a figurative controlled burn. In other words, state legislatures would see improved education results if they would end colleges of education, end their state licensure programs, and just allow regular people with good college degrees to go into classrooms with a little bit of training on education. Heads explode when we say that. Why? Because it's all about power. It's not about outcome. And so I think the more we embrace this idea of a controlled burn, the more helpful it will be for us to be involved locally, because a lot of our local institutions need this too.
Yeah, the private institutions are one piece, but the piece that really freaked out the Democratic Party over the course of the 2024 campaign cycle was the part of Project 2025 that said, hey, these civil servants, Schedule F on the table, a lot of other mechanisms on the table.
Why imagine that employees can be fired.
Why do you think that was their biggest talking point? Like, you had Mallory McMorrow, Notre Dame grad, very bad. I've messaged some people from Notre Dame and said, why hasn't anyone condemned the person promoting radical abortion legislation in the state of Michigan? Why hasn't anyone condemned it? I don't know. I'm just asking questions. Slams the book on the rostrum, and she's, they're gonna fire all these civil servants, and they're gonna have to replace them with people who serve the president. Then everyone in the Democratic National Convention went, they're going to have to serve the president? You mean the guy who runs the executive branch elected by the American people? How terrible. Why do you think that was their biggest bugaboo with the whole project?
Because they've gotten away with a corruption of how the executive branch should work since the 1930s. And it got worse in the 60s with the expansion of government under the misnomer Great Society. And it has unfortunately gotten worse through most Republican administrations. And so what we succeeded in doing, and not just us at Heritage, but some great movement friends, many other organizations, is put our finger on the very thing that the left thought we would never have the gall to do or to say. And that is the source of their power. And that's the nearly 2.5 million federal government employees. And again, sort of like the example we just talked about regarding the EPA law enforcement people, truly nothing against them as people other than the rotten jerks who are really evil. We wish them the best. It's just that they don't have a right to those jobs. And they certainly don't have a right to those jobs if they say, I'm going to do what I do. I don't care what the president says. 80 million Americans just elected him to be president. You're damn well going to do what he says.
Right.
And then sometimes the follow-up question is, I got this from someone in legacy media outlet, well, what about the scientifically oriented jobs? Well, then they need to be following the scientific method rather than saying, here is the conclusion we're reaching, and we're going to give you billions of dollars to reach that conclusion, even if the scientific method isn't allowed. They can't respond to this because we have never been so focused on it. And that tells me that we need to keep the focus on that if, in fact, we're able to at least dramatically reduce the top-heavy education department and reform the FBI and find 6 or 8 other examples of agencies that really need to be overhauled, if not eliminated. You're going to see a reduction in the federal workforce, and Americans are going to feel that directly because of the regulatory power of the administrative state.
Every single time I would field questions about Project 2025, especially when I moved from the old place to the new place, Project 2020, you're going to work in that building right now and you're going to have colleagues who are talking about Project 2025. I said, yeah, ask me about Project 2025. And they go, yeah, so First off, I fielded a funny question from a friend. Do you know this Russ Vogt character? He seems like a really scary guy. My friend Russ Vogt.
It's like the most mild-mannered person on earth.
The most normal guy ever. Whenever I would field questions, though, about Project 2025, the civil service thing was really, really something that scared them. And also, why would they put this product out? I said, well, the Heritage Foundation is a think tank. It's a very normal thing for think tanks to do. In fact, the Heritage Foundation has come out with the mandate for leadership every 4 years for a really, really long time. A lot of similar policy proposals in that guidebook. The Brookings Institute, for example, this year on their website, I believe the final tally was under their Election 24 tab was over 6,000 different pieces of content on the election, and their version of election integrity, non-election integrity, and things that a Kamala Harris administration could do in the 4 years that followed had she won. This is not a weird thing for think tanks to do, to think about how to influence policy to meet their specific, political ends. Why do you think that this was the product that caught such fire? Was it just because it's more radical, and by radical I mean radix, getting to the root? Was it because it's more radical than previous editions of this product that Heritage has put out, or was it because of the specific political moment? I mean, why do you think it caught wildfire?
It's because it's so damn good.
Yeah.
Every mandate for leadership, which is the book part, the set of policies since 1980 has been great. Heritage scholars from across the conservative movement have always contributed to that. It's always very good. But in this case, the charge that I gave all of those folks was meet the moment. Every election's vital. This one's particularly so because of what the radical left is doing. And we've got to be at the top of our game and really thorough and comprehensive in the plans that we're articulating. Point one. And then point two, to your point about radical in terms of getting to the roots. Yes, we didn't want to just nibble on the edges, just do some tweaking in terms of legislation. We really thought that if the American people deliver conservatives a political win, that we must, as conservatives, wield that power appropriately and be robust, to say the least, in the policy objectives that we have. But then the third thing is we've never involved basically the entire conservative movement. And the reason we did that is because I believed firmly that we had to end or at least diminish the fractiousness in the conservative movement. And so doing that, inviting really every conservative group that does federal policy work into the project, and all but a couple joined, made it a bigger target. And on that point, we should have anticipated that the left would have been just lost their ever-loving minds as a result. But ultimately, their efforts failed. They wasted a bunch of money. And what they did succeed in doing is double the number of people who are in the personnel database from 10,000 to 20,000. And what's great about that is this personnel database isn't just about the Trump-Vance administration or, for that matter, federal government. It's also for state and local government. So I'm grateful that a good portion of the $1 billion that Kamala Harris raised actually helped us expand the reach of the project, because it's actually going to allow us to expand the number of states and places where these great people are going to be involved. So they inspired a lot of Americans to rise up, and I can't thank them enough.
Can't thank the Kamala Harris campaign enough. I didn't think I'd hear you say that today when we sat down for this interview, frankly.
I thank them about that.
Hey, we're inviting you into friendship, Kamala Harris and company. Actually, Joe Biden, let's just give him, because he voted for Trump, right?
It certainly looks like it to me.
I mean, come on, Joe Biden. The water's fine. We'll give you, you could have a podcast or something. It could be like, what the Democrats did wrong, and it can just all be about how they threw a coup on you. I heard this critique from a friend of mine from the right about Project 2025. I thought it was interesting. And I don't think you and I have talked about this before.
I'm a big boy, so you can state the critique.
I think it's interesting. It's an interesting perspective, though. It wasn't like you're putting the whole play. You heard Kamala Harris say this a lot. Can you believe they wrote that down? It's not something this person was knowledgeable about the mandate for leadership in the past, but there's one of the interesting things, and I think the reason that some people on the right were angry with the project was because it potentially had the prospect of undermining what Hamilton puts out in Federalist 70, which is the importance of secrecy and dispatch in the executive branch in particular. For I'll nerd out now for a second. Articles of Confederation, right? They did not have a traditional executive branch. They had a council of executives that were appointed by the legislature throughout the Constitutional Convention. It was a live debate on whether or not you're going to have multiple executives or a single executive, or what the executive branch should look like for the federal government. And then you get to the Federalist Papers after the Constitutional Convention is through, and Hamilton's writing in Federalist 70 about the importance of a unitary executive. And one of the importances he outlines is that need for secrecy and dispatch. And if you're doing everything by committee, as we know here in Washington, D.C., things get leaked, things don't get done. Where does the buck stop? And their critique was, there is an element of giving away the game a little bit, and maybe there should have been more secrecy in dispatch. What do you think about that?
Valid critique. Mm-hmm. Very valid critique. And I love the invoking of Federalist 70 on that. But three things. The first is that the reason we did this on scale and published Mandate for Leadership 2 years, 18 months before the election is because the conservative movement was desperate for a plan. And stalwarts in the conservative movement, from grassroots people to donors, were on the brink of walking away because they heard a lot of complaining and they heard a lot of personality-focused attention, but they didn't see any plans. And they demanded, rightly, that Heritage and all of these groups come together and end the fractiousness and work together on a plan. And so I would argue that the greater good at that point, even more than secrecy and dispatch, was that. But the second thing is directly on this really important goal of secrecy and dispatch, is that the work that think tanks do is not dispatch per se. Mm-hmm. It's about forming the public will around policy solutions, or at least I should say the work that Heritage does. We don't exist just to write papers, and we don't exist just to write papers and lobby for them in Congress. We also want to develop the popular will for that. That's impossible to do secretly. But then the third thing is there are 4 parts of Project 2025, the Mandate for Leadership that we've just been talking about that we published, the personnel database and the training for those personnel. The 4th part, motivated by Federalist number 70. Mm-hmm. It is the secrecy and dispatch. Totally appropriate, ethical ideas, but that's been completely behind the scenes because of the sensitivity of it and the speed with which those ideas will be, not might be, will be implemented. And so all this attention that was on the personnel database and the Mandate for Leadership actually was very helpful in keeping secret the dispatch that will be part of the next government.
Back to the new book, Dawn's Early Light. Gosh, I almost want to just be like, let's just let that sit there for a while. But back to Dawn's Early Light, when we were in conversation about the book on Thursday, I asked you, Dawn's Early Light isn't quite morning in America. What will it take in 2028 for you to say it'll be morning in America? And you said, it's very simple metric. An overwhelming majority of Americans, when surveyed, say they believe in the American dream again. I sit here recently married, hoping to buy a house. At some point, it's not going to cost me one of my kidneys and potentially another organ. What could that new American dream look like? Because I can't help but look back and say, the American dream that my grandparents grew up with and that my father grew up with might not be accessible to me in the same way. How will our conception of what the American dream constitutes, how should that shift? I don't think it needs to shift metaphysically or on principle, but I think that maybe the material conditions that we associate with the American dream might have to be reevaluated.
It's a worry. Mm-hmm. And allow the historian to use a historical example. Andrew Jackson used this powerful metaphor of the frozen stream. to speak about the American dream. He repeatedly in one of his presidential campaigns, and this is directly about not just the American dream, but what is at the heart of the American dream, which is socioeconomic mobility. And what he argued was that while there was some movement in the winter on a stream that's frozen at the top, some movement within the part of the stream that was still liquid, no one could break through the top. They couldn't break through the frozen surface. Mm-hmm. That's what's beginning to happen. Actually, we're about halfway down that path in the United States. And that's an indicator when that happens that you've lost one of the vital parts of what makes America America, which is this promise, even if it seems like a long shot, that you could go, just keep with this metaphor, from the bottom of the stream, like some little amoeba, and turn into this organism and break through and be one of the wealthiest people. But for us at Heritage, it isn't just about economic wealth, although if that's what motivates someone, fine, but it's about a flourishing. And so we would argue that the frozen stream isn't just about purely economic mobility, but about your desire and your wife's desire to say, we would like, in some reasonable amount of time, making a decent living, to afford a home. But that's impossible because what I cover in the book, I call cost disease socialism. There's layer upon layer, public policy, some individual decisions we make, cultural factors, and the thing that we can control as a society easily are those policies. And so let's peel back those policies. One of the reasons we have to eliminate the Department of Education is because it has had a direct inflationary impact on college tuition. It makes it unaffordable. One of the reasons that RFK is going to be successful as Secretary of HHS is not just because of what he represents in terms of living better lives and lifestyles, but that we hopefully will make progress in eliminating the federal government as a third-party payer on healthcare. That's what causes inflation there. Both of these are the most significant drivers in why you can't afford a home, and why it was difficult for us moving from Central Texas to Northern Virginia. And I'm 25 years into my career. These are problems that are not born out of simply individual decisions about whether a married couple wants to have 2 full-time incomes or 1.5 or 1. We want, as J.D. Vance says so eloquently, the decisions to be back fully, squarely between husband and wife when they're making those decisions, as opposed to all of these external factors driving such a big part of the equation. This is going to take a generation to fix, which is why I speak about it with such urgency in the book.
I'm going to adjust my previous statement that maybe nothing metaphysical or principled or on the principle level needs to change with the American dream. A lot of people, when you talk to folks in this town in particular, just says, well, the American dream is, America's a creedal nation. American dream is just freedom. Freedom!
It's not. And it's so much more than that.
It's so much more than that. And we're both Catholic. I get very excited when I go to Mass on Sunday and I see an African priest. There's a wonderful African priest at the parish where my wife and I go on Sunday morning, just down the street. And he had this wonderful homily last weekend where he goes, and I love African priests so much. If you're Catholic and you're watching this, you completely understand what I'm saying. He goes, freedom is the discipline to effectuate the good. And I go,
boom.
That's it.
Yep.
Freedom is the discipline to effectuate the good. Put that into an American context, right? What type of discipline do conservatives need to have as they enter this time where they're going to be in power, at least for 2 years, with a trifecta? What type of discipline do they need to have to effectuate the good?
80% of the discipline they need to have is an interior discipline. They need to go to church, whatever that is. This is a pluralistic country. Go to church, pick one. Ask your friend where you should go. And if you're not convinced of that, then take the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, who said, if you're struggling to form a habit, start. And neuroscientists tell us that if you are trying to start a new habit and you do it for 3 days, it's a habit. If you're trying to break a bad habit, do that for 3 days, and it's no longer a habit. I really do mean this. And you know that as a colleague of an adjacent organization that I preach often to do the small things in excellence. And the third thing is live the kind of lifestyle eating well and sleeping well and monitoring, what you ingest during a very busy time, because the country has asked you to serve it in the same way that it's asked you, other men and women, to go to literal war. This is war. This is war, figuratively, against the deep state. But that also means it's a spiritual war, hence the comment about the 80%. But then the fourth thing is the discipline that we have to have, which is, I think, closer to the heart of your question, Bradley, is the discipline to understand limiting principles. We've been given a policy mandate, and part of that mandate is to begin the dismantling of the administrative state. What we can't assume, ought not assume, and ought to have the discipline to remember is that the American people will want check-ins about how it's going. And so as we sit here, the president has not yet named a Secretary of Education. And let's say he nominates someone whom the American people believe is that figure who's going to begin the dismantling. If that man or woman goes through that process and doesn't focus on the communication that's required, say to your stepmom, people are probably can be persuaded, at least on an incremental plan, doesn't spend time with public school teachers, doesn't spend time addressing the nation about what the progress is, it'll be stillborn. So the limiting principle we ought to have is the cardinal virtue of humility. And then finally, I would say they ought to have the discipline of fortitude, the discipline of not reading legacy media outlets, the discipline not to give one iota about what the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and all the other garbage outlets have to say. Have the fortitude not to go to those websites, not to turn on CBS News, and spend time outside Washington with real Americans who are demanding that you come to this city and you fix it. Anything short of that discipline is failure. And we at Heritage are watching.
Dr. Kevin Roberts, thank you for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me. You're awesome.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.